sell your soul to providers of various sorts. I'm going to talk about the whole project as well, but I'm going to do it from a much narrower subset of the web. But in my opinion, and Claude's not going to disagree, it's also the most important subspecie eternitatis. I'm going to be talking about the web as a contributor to knowledge and science and the growth of knowledge and science, which is not about selling your soul to the vendors. Selling your souls to the vendors, I should say. First of all, this is collaborative research as with everybody else. Odile Marcotte is a mathematician at UQAM and Gérard. Alexandre Blondin-Massé is also a mathematician here at UQAM and UQAC. Yassim Gargouri finished his degree in cognitive informatics at UQAM, and now he's a postdoc in my lab. Philippe, where are you? Okay, Philippe is a major contributor to the empirical part of it, Philippe Vincent Lamarre. He's with me, but regrettably, I'm going to lose him to Ottawa in September. Melanie Lord is not here, but she's also a collaborator. Vincent Larivière is one of the speakers earlier in the summer school, second day, I think it was. And Munira Greyes is a doctoral student who works with Odile Marcotte on some of this stuff. So we've seen the Summer Institute on Web Science and the Mind, and we know that it was divided into several modules. I don't know what module you would actually want to put yourself into, Claude, whether it's data web or social web, but data web was the more technical stuff that scared some of you and drove some of you into your Facebook instead of the talks. But nevertheless, although I haven't got time because I won't be able to give you my perspective if I go through every single one of them, those data intensive and technical talks were relevant and opened the eyes of some people to some things for sure. The social web was more evident, and I suppose Claude would think of his work as being more there, but he's emphasizing the two cultures. I would also say that the work on natural language processing falls in the area of social web because, after all, verbal interaction is a social activity. Where would you classify yourself? Yeah. And then we got to the controversial stuff, and I'll be talking about a little bit about the controversial stuff at the end, but for those of you who are expecting that this is all going to be a tirade against the extended mind, it's not going to be. I'll try to work it up gradually. And the global brain as well. By the way, half the program was on extended mind and global brain. I wouldn't have invited them if I didn't think it was extremely worthwhile to hear what they have to say, whether or not one frail person like myself may disagree with some of the things they say. So all of this will arrive. Now why did I say Memetrics? Memetrics is a measure of memes. Web metrics is the measure of stuff going on the web. Now, first of all, what are memes? Memes were, the word was invented by, was co-opted actually by Richard Dawkins, the author of the Selfish Gene. When he exhausted the Darwinian story and the Darwinian paradigm, there were still some things that he wanted to say something about. Genes are, Darwin didn't know it, but genes are physical things. They're actually I won't get into the biochemistry, but they're physical objects that are contained in our inner workings, the DNA. And when you talk about genes, you're not talking about a fiction. Darwin didn't know about genes, but the things that he said about traits being encoded somehow in the organism are actually encoded by genes. And then the traits are the usual Darwinian traits, the ones that increase your success in surviving and in reproducing. Almost by definition, if those traits, whether they're physical structures or behaviors, if they're encoded in your genes, then if they indeed help you survive and reproduce, then they're going to be there in the next generation. That's what it means to successfully survive and reproduce, which is to pass on your genetic material, or half of it, to the next generation. Genotype, which is the traits, and the genes, phenotype, which is the traits, and the genes are a duality that you have in the domain of genes and genetically coded traits. What are memes? Memes have similar features. They're also things that either survive or don't survive. They pass on from generation to generation and grow, or they don't. In that sense, they're analogous to genes. They're also things that we do, our organisms do. So a product of the behavior, not the structure, but the behavior of organisms is memes, which is, and then the countless examples of it, people emphasize ideas, but I mean every object that we create or an animal creates, to the extent that they are recreated in the next generation by other animals, they're memes as well. The word meme means to imitate, and we'll get back to that as well. In some respects, there is imitation there that there isn't in the case of genetics, except in the genetics of mimicry, because of course one of the traits that you can get genetically is that your physical appearance resembles the physical appearance of some other species, because you, for some reason, like butterflies that resemble bad tasting butterflies tend to be less predated upon than butterflies that don't. So sometimes there's mimetics in the genetic sphere, but mostly mimetics is in the mimetic field, where things are literally imitated and passed on by either by jest or by gesture or action, like tools and artifacts, or by word of mouth. And in fact, my primary interest is on word of mouth. I think there's a close connection between the explosion, nobody knows for sure, but the explosion of artifacts 300,000 years ago and the advent of language. I don't think you need language in order to sculpt or to hunt or to make a tool, but there was something about the cognitive change that occurred when we had the language that facilitated all of that. And I would say the vast majority of what we call culture, and that's all memes as well, is thanks to language. So I will be focusing more on language and words as memes than on artifacts themselves, but this should apply to everything. Now, the web, and Claude more or less mentioned it, and so did Guy. The web is the digital counterpart of all these memes. I mean, bits are memes in themselves, but now that we have metadata tags that point to objects in the real world, basically the web is becoming the repository of our memes, or at least the digital incarnation of our memes. And all of the open data and memetrics, which is to say measurements, analytics on memes, are digital memetrics being done on the web. So the web has taken... Even in the case of language, when you talk about what language is for and why it evolved, it's hard to say that language evolved in order to, that there was in order to is not a biological language, that the adaptive advantage of language and that caused language to be favored by selection and retention in the usual Darwinian way 300,000 years ago was in order to sit here and discuss science and write about science. It wasn't. It was somehow latent in whatever it is that happened 300,000 years ago, but it wasn't specifically this. Just like, and I'll give the inverse of the example that everybody uses in sociobiology, our sweet tooth for sugar did not evolve for our current candy machine dominated culture where all it does is give you tooth decay and obesity, etc. The original environment had some pressures that resulted in certain outcomes that were useful to our ancestors. And then with time, those same traits got co-opted for other reasons, and memetrics and in general the web is a very late development in something that was originally triggered by mimesis itself, imitation, and eventually, I think, most of all, by language. Because, and I also have to remind you of this, every sentence in every programming language, in every mathematical formal language, logical language is a sentence in English and in French and in Russian. It's language that allows you to have formal languages. It's natural language that allows you to have formal languages. All of that was latent in what happened 300,000 years ago. The result, I think, we talk a lot about Creative Commons licenses, what are you allowed to do with data that appears on the web. In many, by the way, are you familiar with the notion of a commons? The metaphor here is that if you have pasture land, that doesn't belong to anybody in particular, individually, but anybody who is in the area can graze their cattle in the pasture land. That's called a commons. But obviously, the tragedy of the commons is when everybody over-exploits it and then it vanishes. A disanalogy in Claude's analogy with oil and big data is that big data doesn't have, it's not that we're going to run out of big data. On the contrary, we're going to have more and more of it, whereas oil, of course, we do run out of. We can over-exploit the oil commons. It never was a commons. But the web is in many ways our cognitive commons. It's where we put our cognitive goods, not just our commercial goods, not just the stuff that we want to sell, buy, but also what it is that, again, in 300,000 years ago began in our minds, which is the desire to kind of understand things and explain things. Not always with the objective of applying it so that we can help people more or make money, but simply to know things. It's the intrinsic curiosity of the primate brain and probably the mammalian brain. And it's been realized on the web now. That's where we put all of our intellectual goods, or we ought to, because one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the fact that paradoxically, whereas the commercial community and the consumer community caught on to the potential of buying and selling and advertising on the web instantly, virtually instantly, and exploiting it enormously, the scholarly and scientific community has been slower to do it. They're the ones who created the web. I mean, we've heard the cult of Tim Berners-Lee evoked many times here, but he didn't do it for the sake of nexology, right? It ended up that way. He did it for the sake of physicists at CERN, the ones you've betrayed and left behind. So, what cognition? If I say it's a cognitive commons, I have to say what cognition is. There's a lot of, especially in the extended mind, there was a lot of loose and fast discussion about cognition, mentality, etc., etc. We'll get back to that. I want to give you a simple, this is not an operational definition. This is really just a common sense notion that you can take with you about cognition is. Cognition, to a great extent, is the acquisition and application of categories. Categories, and this is important, categories are just doing the right thing with the right kind of thing. Where the category comes in is when you say kind. You have to learn what to do. And I'll leave it to you to enumerate how many of the things that you call cognitive capacities really are categorization capacities. The reason that I wanted to bring it to categories is not just because I work on categories, but because a meme is in many ways a category. And the memes that are spread, at least the intellectual memes, I don't know about the commercial ones, that are spread on the web are categories, all the way from simple exchanges in tweets to scientific papers that report new discoveries and new concepts in science and in scholarship. We have to learn categories. Most of our categories are not built into us by our genes. We have some categories that are genetically encoded, but most of them are learned. Our capacity to learn categories is genetically encoded. And in fact, as I'll come to later, our language capacity is now the lion's share of our capacity to learn categories. We also have another way of learning categories, acquiring categories that we share with other species, and that is it was talked about a little bit during this summer school, and that is learning what's what and what to do with what by trial and error. Learning from the consequences, doing the right thing with the right kind of thing, and then doing the wrong thing with it, and then getting bad consequences from that. Basically, learning by corrective feedback. That's a way of acquiring categories that we share with all social species and just about all learning species. Even an aplesia that learns when to withdraw its reflexes and when not to is learning a category. It's learning to do the right thing or the wrong thing. I'll talk a little bit categorize. In fact, I'll do it now. This is earlier research here. We work on how it is that we learn categories, and one of the side effects of learning a new non-trivial category is it can actually change the way the world looks to you. This is the old Worf-Sapir hypothesis that your language and your culture shapes the way reality looks to you. That's probably overstated, and it certainly was overstated in the case of colors. It's not true that the reason we see red, white, and green, red, yellow, green, blue, etc. in the rainbow, that the reason we see that is because our culture cuts the rainbow that way, and another culture that cuts the rainbow in a different way will see different qualities. Those qualities are Darwinian, built into our nervous systems, but there are other categories that we learn, not color categories, which are already there. There are other categories that we learn from scratch, so to speak, that do have a mild effect on our perception that's similar to the qualitative bands in the frequency spectrum of the rainbow. And we did experiments on this in which we taught, and we still do experiments in which we teach subjects to learn texture categories, unfamiliar texture categories, under the false instruction that this is created by two different computer graphics artists, and they have their own style, and you have to learn. Doing the right thing with the right kind of thing in this particular lab experiment is saying this was done by artist A and this was done by artist B or whatever, and learning it. And we can vary the difficulty, and it turns out that if it's very difficult, you can't learn it. But if it's learnable, then not only do you learn it, so that in the end you finally know how to do it, but there's this categorical perception effect where the differences within a category become compressed. Things that are in the same category start to look more alike, and things that are in different categories start to look more different. I'm not talking about categorical perception here. I'm just telling you that this is one of the side effects of learning a category successfully, and it's probably the way that your brain, when it extracts the properties that distinguish the members from the non-members and learns to ignore everything else, it's probably the way that it biases your perception so that you can quickly spot what's a member and what's not a member. Then we went on to do some genetic language origin simulations in which we taught little organisms to learn categories two possible ways. One, the way that our subjects in the laboratory learn it, which is by trial and error, correction, trial, error, correction, until they finally get it right. That's learning by induction. And we share it with all species. And then we had a second capability that we built into this artificial world with the little Pac-Man creatures that try to sort mushrooms. We gave them the capacity to learn by overhearing, actually overseeing what other Pac-Man, what other organisms already have learned. And we called it originally learning by honest toil, which is by trial and error and correction, and learning by theft. But it's not really theft, and I want to emphasize that it's not really theft. As long as there are plenty of mushrooms, I don't lose anything if I say that's the kind you can eat, that's the kind you can't eat. But on the other hand, what we quickly found out from these simulations is you cannot learn all categories by instruction. You can only learn, you have to learn a basic number of them by direct, just like all the other species, by induction. But once you have a certain number of categories that you've already learned by induction, then you can learn the rest of them by instruction. And we'll come back to this. In this toy world, the only things there were three categories. There were edible mushrooms and inedible mushrooms. You had to learn that the hard way, like the rest of the mammalian kingdom. And there were also markable mushrooms and unmarkable ones, the ones where you had to mark where they were or they didn't. And if you didn't do it right, then you lost survival and reproduction points, and eventually you either died or you didn't reproduce. So you had to learn what was edible, you had to learn what was markable, and then when there was a third kind of mushroom, which is the kind of mushroom you have to return to, there were two different ways you could learn it in principle. You could learn it the hard way, the same way you learned the first two categories, or, because the rule for being a returnable mushroom was that a returnable mushroom is one that has the properties of an edible mushroom and a markable mushroom. So it was simple conjunction. Edible and markable equals returnable. That you could learn in two different ways. The hard way, which takes time and which is risky because you might die or you could poison yourself, or by theft, in which case you know right away. And within a few generations, the organisms that learned the third category by theft were the only ones left. All the surviving organisms were learning by theft. And we think this was a kind of a toy model of what the origin of language was and what the adaptive value of language is. It allows you to transfer categories that you've learned to other organisms and saving them the trouble of learning it by trial and error. That's learning by instruction rather than deduction. Now, I never give a talk without the Chinese dictionary. I don't care what the topic is about. If you try to learn the meaning of words from not a big database, but a sizable database like a dictionary, it's all in there. If you don't know Chinese and you want to know what any word in Chinese means, just look it up. It's there. The definition is there. The only trouble is, what if you don't know what the words in the definition mean? Well, that's no problem. You look those up as well. And I can go on, but there's something wrong here, right? And what's wrong is the symbol grounding problem. It can't be instruction, it can't be verbal all the way down. You had to have, like with our organisms, you have to have a sensorimotor direct grounding and direct sensorimotor experience, and then the rest of it can be built out of that. That's the symbol problem. And what we want, so the question we asked was fine. So you need a certain amount of categories that you get some other way in order to ground all categories. By the way, the trajectory we're going through is these words at the origin of language are eventually going to become all of our memes and all of our capacity to produce memes. Bits, as I said, every data string that you can pronounce is part of natural language. So we're headed towards that. But the question is, how much do we need in order to start the journey? And in particular, in a dictionary, how many of these originally grounded memes, directly grounded memes, do you need in order to be able to acquire and generate all the rest by recombinations alone? In particular, in a dictionary, how many words do you need to know and which ones in order to be able to define all the rest of them by words alone? So the way we did this was we took, this is just a toy dictionary. Please don't take this seriously. This is just to illustrate how we pared down the dictionary. We took a dictionary, and you can throw out immediately all the words that are not used to define any further words. You get there by definition, but they don't, I don't know, what's an abstruse term in astrophysics, Claude, that it takes a lot to define, but that you don't use it to define anything else?
Not very sure.
Anyway, so you have them in every field. You have them in English as well. In biology, you have tons of them, where it takes a long, complicated definition to define. Pardon?
Accretion.
Okay, accretion, fine. So you can get to accretion. Well, but actually, we use accretion for other purposes. But let's say the special sense of accretion. Words have many meanings, and I'm not talking about polysemy, but the special sense of an accretion. In mathematics, this is an even better example, where you say, if I've proved a theorem that was worth proving, then it's going to generate a definition. I've also come up with an object that's worthy of being given a name. So once you get to a theorem that you prove, and then you name the object all of the things that have the property of continuous differentiable, blah, 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 we'll call those quarks. If that quark doesn't enter into the definition of anything else, you can throw it out of your dictionary because you can get to it already. And so we throw them out. And in this toy dictionary, we throw out tomato and banana because they're already defined. They don't go anywhere. We throw out more and more. We throw out fruit, yellow, red. They don't go anywhere. I repeat, this is a toy dictionary. This is not what you really throw out in a dictionary. And then you throw out that edible. And then you're left with something that we call the kernel. This is the set of words, the 10% of the dictionary, of our vocabulary, from which we can define everything else, but we can't throw anything else in that kernel. Otherwise, there's words in the kernel that you can't define. But the kernel, 10% of the dictionary, is not the smallest number of words from which you can define all the rest. That smallest number of words, and that's why I told you that these graph theorists were here for something, is called, in graph theoretic terms, the minimal feedback vertex set of the dictionary graph. Think of the dictionary graph as consisting of a bunch of words. Some of them are defining words, and some of them are defined words, and there's links. We've cut down that dictionary graph to what we call the kernel, which is the 10% that you can't take out any more words, otherwise the kernel itself contains words that you can't get to anymore. You can get to everything in the rest of the 90%. That's not the smallest number. The smallest number, according to graph theory, the minimal feedback vertex set, is a subgraph from which all the rest can be reached. Now, what's the size of that? The problem with finding that subgraph is that it happens to be, the problem with finding minimal feedback vertex sets in general is NP complete. That's bad news. It could take the lifespan of the universe to find it. But fortunately, for medium-sized data sets like dictionaries, we can do it with a lot of, and that's what Odile and Alexandre did with a with a lot of work, they can find the minimal feedback vertex set, and it turns out there's not one, there's many. The first thing you ask is, how many words are there in it? And we've done it on 4 dictionaries, but it's roughly, let's say, 2,000 words. But it's not a unique 2,000 words. The 2,000 words are always in the kernel. They're in this set over here. But you, with little variance, you can produce a lot of minimal feedback vertex sets, all of which can generate the whole dictionary. And that's not necessarily bad news. Not all of us, first of all, I don't think that what we do in life is we ground a minimal feedback vertex set and then the rest of it is all done verbally. That's not true. We still keep on seeing, tasting, feeling things. We still keep on doing induction. But in principle, it is possible. That's one of the remarkable powers of natural language, that you can say anything and everything, and if you understand it and you well enough to explain it, you can explain it all in words. That's what a lecture does. That's what textbooks do, etc. It helps to add a few pictures and a few examples, but in the end, it can all, in principle, be described in words. You can, by the way, this blue thing is the kernel, and then within the kernel, the min-back vertex set, which here is a trivial one. It's just not and no. Is that? And then you can go back from there. You can kind of look at a distance of words from origin in this sense. You can build up a hierarchy where you have a decimal distance of 1, 2, 3 until you get the entire dictionary. Having done that, and this is Philippe's analysis, we found that I should go back. Although this is bad for the tape. This is the kernel. And within the kernel, that dark blue thing is what we call the minimal feedback vertex set. Pardon me, excuse me. That's the core. It's the largest completely interconnected, you don't need to know this, a completely interconnected subgraph. These are just structures within the graph. What I need them for is to tell you that the rest of the dictionary, the 90%, is the part that's outside the kernel. The kernel is, you already know what the kernel is. The core is this big, completely interconnected subset that's within the kernel, and it is not a minimal feedback vertex set. In order to produce a minimal feedback vertex set, the minimal grounding set we call it, you have to take part core and part the satellites, which are little completely connected sets where you a set of words that defines another set of words and then they define backwards to one another. Those, if you take a combination of core words and satellite words, you can create a minimal feedback vertex set. And we found, having done this purely graph theoretically in a dictionary, we found that these words differ in their psycholinguistic properties. The first one, and the one you would expect the most, fortunately, is that as you get towards the middle, towards a minimal feedback vertex set, those words are learned earlier. They're acquired earlier. In addition, in general, they're more concrete than the rest of the dictionary, the outside part. And they're also more frequent in the language. I haven't got time to discuss it. There are some subtle, Philippe had a poster up there, and this is not about that work in particular. There's some subtle reversals on the subject of concreteness, and concreteness is an interesting question. You need some concrete words and you need some abstract words in order to make a minimal feedback vertex set. It's not all just concrete words like chair, table, apple. You need some more abstract words. But anyway, what it seems as if we found is that these formal properties of a dictionary are reflected in their real-life properties, and they tend to confirm the fact that the inner part might be what grounds our knowledge, our verbal knowledge. These minimal feedback vertex sets. I can talk in discussion about what's the idea about many different ones, but let's go on. What I was speaking about originally was the first big and biggest cognitive revolution, which is the capacity to learn categories by language. I can now transfer by word of mouth categories that would have taken a lot of trial and error experience otherwise. That's the first and biggest revolution. The second one is handwriting. That came 6,000 years ago, when those spoken words, which vanish as soon as you speak them and can only be passed on by oral tradition, got passed on by graphic tradition. They got encoded graphically. Then they became print. And then we came to our era, which I call skywriting. That's when the bits are all up in the cognitive commons, the memes, the verbal memes, the verbal and digital counterparts of all of the memes are up there in the web. The first revolution was 300,000 years ago. The second revolution was 60 years ago. Print was 600 years ago. The internet was created more than 40 years ago, actually. And the web, for which I can't find a better icon, was about 25 years ago. What made possible was a form of, we talked a lot about this, about collective intelligence, collaborative this and collaborative that. They made possible a form of interactive cognition that was not possible before. We talk a lot in psychology about mind-reading capacity. And we think of it usually as a nonverbal thing. When it was presented by, which was the talk yesterday? It was Malone. Tom Malone said that the capacity to discern from a facial expression what a person is thinking, wanting, etc., is an interesting trait that predicts group activity. But in fact, animals can do this too. I mean, animals can tell whether you're going to attack them, or you're angry, or you're afraid, etc. Animals, non-human animals can. To do it by the old kind of memetics, which is just by there's a motor theory of facial expression, which is I know what your facial expression means because I know what it feels like to generate that facial expression. So I know what it feels like to be agitated, to be angry, to be afraid, etc. I decode these, and these are probably innate. These are the capacity to decode human facial expressions, which animals can't do, and we can't decode many non-human animal facial expressions either. I don't know if you can tell when a wolf goes like this. What does that mean? That does not mean it's surprise the way it does in our case. It's actually a threat expression. But you have to learn. We can learn that, but we're not born with that. We are born with the capacity to decode human facial expressions, and we can pass on a lot that way, especially when we're learning by imitation. There was a lot of discussion in the Rob Goldstone and others discussed learning by imitation. But consider this, and there are two nonverbal things that we can do that were forerunners of language, but they're certainly not language. One is the capacity, which very few animals and possibly only us have, is to recognize when something is pointed, that what you're in a sense doing is pointing at an object, and what you have in mind is an object. That's not language. And you can act out things in a pantomime. You can, if there's a dangerous creature coming, you can act out the dangerous creature and transmit it to someone else. So by pantomime and by pointing, you can communicate a lot. Maybe even some internal. You can do some mind reading that way because of expressions. But the real mind reading nuclear weapon is language. I can tell you that I have a splitting migraine. I can have no expression on my face, but if I'm telling you the truth, I have a splitting migraine, or I just got a terrific idea, let me tell you it. That's mind reading and mind writing, if you like, that no other species can do. And that's as a consequence of having learned language. And that's what made science, scholarship, culture, commerce possible. That capacity. So as I said, we have now our cognitive commons turns out to be the web itself. But how am I doing for time, by the way? Anybody know? What? What? Okay, so I'm coming around. Now I want to concentrate a little bit on a paradox. We've agreed that this is our cognitive commons. Everything's up there. Our products are up there. Our advertisements are up there. Our tweets and our chats and our I'm just headed for the toilet now. Everything is up there. One of the things, and perhaps the most important components that we want, which is science and scholarship itself, is not up there. And the real question is, why is that not up there? And what can we do to get it up there? The answer to that is certainly not that there's no interest of scientists and scholars in getting their stuff up there. The answer is that with the advent of print, we married ourselves to a technology, print on paper, that was costly to disseminate. And so we had to have publishers mediating between the creator of the product, if you want to call it a product, and the consumers of the product. In the case of trade writing, it's still the case. I mean, people who write for trade are not interested in giving away their journal articles, their magazine articles, or their newspaper articles, or they're paid for writing them. Let's say newspaper articles might bring in advertisement revenue, but if somebody writes a novel or a short story or a screenplay, they're not interested in giving it away. They're interested in selling it. So the old technology of blocking access to the memes by with a paywall still applies to that kind of thing. But in science and scholarship, or at least let's narrow it, because scientists sometimes write best-selling books as well, trade books. But for when we're communicating with one another, when scientists and scholars are writing for other scientists and scholars in refereed journals, just narrow it down to that. It's bigger than that. It makes no sense for them not to put it up in the cognitive commons right away. They don't. And they don't because of a leftover from an earlier era, from the third revolution, which is print. The economies of print have locked in the outputs of scientists and scholars, and they're scared. I could use Claude's language. They're scared shitless. Good, you've got it. Okay. About putting it up there because their publishers tell them it's embargoed. We won't and they're afraid they won't be published, and so on. So we have to do something to dislodge that. And the physicists, again, CERN is the one that invented open access. CERN is the one that had the first. Even before the web, we're already sharing preprints freely. And then as soon as the web appeared, of course, the natural transition was to start doing it on the web. And so physicists have already wrapped this up. But the rest of the scholarly and scientific world definitely has not. I naively thought in 1994 that really all I had to do was to tell it, listen, kids, you know, there's this is equivalent to saying, kids, it's raining outside, put on your raincoats. I thought, listen, kids, the web's up there. You want people to read your articles. Your careers are based on citations, and the way that people, the reason you're doing science and scholarship is because you want people to take up your work and build on it. Well, they can't do it unless if you don't put it up there for them. The only ones that can do it are the ones that can afford to subscribe to the journal in which it appears. It's a minority. And even Harvard can't afford to subscribe to most or all journals. So I thought in 1994 all you had to do was tell them to do it, but it's not the first time in which I was wrong. We're 20 years hence, and what I'm going to show you just very quickly is how we're doing. Green open access, which is putting up your scientific and scholarly results refereed on the web, the way that I just described is self-archiving on the web. That's green open access. Gold open access is open access journals. I don't even want to talk about that. Open access journals are meant to come later, and instead people have gotten into gold fever. But this is the way it looks for different fields now in the world. How much of it is green, how much is it gold, and how much of it is neither. And as you see, the majority, it's about the size of the kernel of a dictionary, but the majority of it is not access. Whether you look at it by, notice that 50% is the top there. So whether you look at it by discipline or by country, it's going really slowly, and yet all the reasons are there for doing it. I mean, one of the domains of Memetrics now is counting citations. We heard about PageRank, which is also based on citation counts. In general, if you do a meme that's worth doing, then somebody's going to take it up, and then you need some indication of its uptake, and you've got a measure of impact, if you like. And citations, scholarly citations, when one article cites another, has been our measure of impact, one of our measures of impact for a long time. And you can show that this is the physics archive on the web. I notice that the pointer, yes, this is the physics archive. For those, this is the date of publication. For those who make it freely accessible before the date of publication, their citations go way up, and the ones that are made accessible only to subscribers never catch up with that. Pardon me, it's in physics, virtually everything is open access by the time it's published, because all physicists that are active have their institutions have subscriptions to the few physics journals. So those that wait until the date of publication never catch up in their citation counts to the ones that made it freely accessible in the first place. There's some reason to say that the ones that do it later might have been ashamed of their work, if they're physicists. But this citation advantage is a huge incentive to researchers whose jobs and whose careers and promotion and tenure are based on their citation counts. We don't just count publications anymore, we count citations. And the web makes it possible to even count downloads and all kinds of other measures, which I haven't got time to talk to you about. So what became apparent was that researchers, unlike our ancestors 300,000 years ago, who already started exchanging words for free without charging for them and benefited tremendously from them, researchers are not ready to do this on their own for various reasons. So what we need is mandates, sort of requirements to do it, and they've been adopted by funders and by universities, but they're not all. That's increased the amount of green open access worldwide. I have a more recent image of this, but I didn't have time to put it. But nevertheless, the publisher pushback and the researcher timidity is still holding this back. It's not going nearly as fast as we would have liked. And we did some studies. This is the amount of green open access that you get without and with a mandate. But even those mandates are not quite at 100% yet, so we looked at some of the factors that enter into the strength of a mandate. We did some correlations between a web metric index of strength of mandates. These mandates can ask for various different things. They can ask you to deposit it immediately and make it open access immediately. They can tell you deposit it, or the worst ones are deposited when your publisher says it's all right to deposit it. We'll forget about those. And everything in between. So there are weak mandates and strong mandates. And we found a weak correlation, because Melibea is a kind of a weak measure, a weak correlation between the strength of the mandate and the number of articles that are made open access and how soon they're made open access. I'm going to skip over this because I don't think you have a passionate interest in calibrating mandates, but it's another form of memetrics to be able to influence policy by monitoring not sales and uptake, but monitoring compliance with policies that are meant to increase the contents of the cognitive commons, not the contents of the pockets of providers. I'm going to skip that, and then I'll go into my horse before I finish. There's no question that there's distributed cognition. This stuff, all these internal counterparts of these memes, the ones that generated the memes, are in a head where they're not all in one place. So that's distributed cognition any way you cut it. This, on the other hand, which we've had since before the web, where we dump our memes into books, I don't know if it makes sense or there's any advantage in calling that distributed cognition. The cognition, if cognition means anything, is the mechanism underlying the cognizing, which is what cognizing creatures do while they're thinking. The library is not. I can think about the library, and I can read in the library, which is going to change my thoughts. But I also look up at the moon. The moon is also not part of my cognitive state. The library is not part of my cognitive state. So I think. This is, I think, rather than describing something like this as a distributed cognition, this capacity to do mind reading across one another, I think it's better to call it collaborative cognition. And if it's a bigger, maybe collaborative, if you have a large enough collaboration, not one-on-one, you might want to call it cognizing together, collective cognizing. Just as if you have lots of people moving a log, you're not saying that there's a collectivity that's doing moving. Each individual is doing moving, and when you do it collectively, it has some outcomes. And I even want to say there's distributed cognition in the brain. I want to suggest that things like this are just as much out of the cognitive state, things within my brain, because there's lots of things that are going on in my brain that have nothing to do with what I'm thinking. They may be these data sources, but the data sources could have been outside my brain. So even inside my brain, I have stuff that I wouldn't want to call part of the act of cognizing. The act of cognizing is a felt state. You know when you're thinking about somebody. We talked about intentionality. Intentionality means intended meaning. When I say what was the word you used? Accretion. When I say the word accretion, and I don't mean it in the CERN sense. I mean it in the sense that it's used for when we talk about, you know, accreting parts to other to other parts. In my mind, I know what I mean by that. I don't mean that. I mean this. I say the same word, accretion. But what I have as an intended meaning is something that's inside my head. Thanks to language, I can unwrap it for you. I can say, I don't mean accretion in Claude's sense. I mean accretion in the sense of biology or something like that. So it doesn't matter whether the notebook is in your cortex or outside. It's not part of your cognitive state unless if you unplug the only components of your cognitive state are the ones that if you unplug them, the cognition is gone. Not that if you stop looking at the moon, you stop thinking about the moon, but something is really pulled out and then there's no longer a cognitive state. I suggest that that's a better criterion for what is and isn't in the mind than these loose performance-based ones that we do. And you can run the same number on sensors. I mean, telescopes and microscopes increase my capacity to see small and big things, but I'm not... the act of seeing is still going on inside here, and the mechanism of that action of seeing something is in here. Even if I take away the thing that I'm looking at, I'm not changing the actual cognitive state. I can hallucinate something where there's no object out there as well. It's all in here by my lights. Same with extensors of the mind, same with reality, and with cognitive extensors, of which the web is the recent one. So this is all by its cognitive technology. It's something that helps people cognize, but it's not part of the mental state of cognizing. And of course, these are the most recent mind extenders, the World Wide Web itself. Can extend a brain. There really can be an extended brain. Siamese twins can in principle be using the same brain, so that when somebody touches the left hand of one of the Siamese twins, the other one feels it. They're still two Siamese twins, so they're not having the same mental state, but their mental states are the underlying machinery of their mental states really is overlapping in that case. It's not overlapping if Rachel and I look at the same microphone, and let's say we look at it from the same angle, we're not having the same mental state. She's having a mental state, I'm a cognitive state, I'm having a cognitive state. The microphone is an input to both of them, but we're not having the same mental state. And neither are these twins, if they're attached like that. So just to close, we have the cognitive commons, which contains all of our bits. Bits are all memes. Language made it possible. Language will also make it possible for science and scholarship to proceed incomparably faster and more effectively once we can get our goods up on the cognitive commons. Thank you.